Hi friends! Today I'm going to give you some tips on how to create iridescent feathers like the ones you would find on a hummingbird, a peacock, or any other kind of bird that just seems to shine. I'm using one of my recent hummingbird pieces for this, which features turquoisey, greeny, purpley feathers which look absolutely stunning. Let's go! For this piece I used a reference image from Pixabay, which I will link down below for you, and I'm using a watercolour base and Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils for this. To start this off, I used a Faber-Castell Albert Dürer watercolour pencils to create a good base for the bird. This isn't necessary for creating these types of feathers though. You can also layer down your lighter colours to create a good base and really blend them out with a white pencil or a lighter pencil, or you can even blend with some odourless mineral spirits. Essentially, what you need are those lighter colours down on paper and to map out all of your different colour changes and make sure those colour changes are blended into each other. You want to have smooth colours and no stop-start lines or any kind of rigid block colour. You want to keep your base nice and smooth and free of any direction. This is essential to build your iridescent colour. It can take a while to blend all of your colours until they're seamless, which is why I opted for a watercolour base with this particular bird that you're seeing. When building your base, you also want to map in any dark areas by strengthening the tone or by layering some slightly darker tones down. Now, the number one key thing to creating iridescent feathers is to use a harmonious colour palette, or rather to use similar toned pencils. You want to take a look at a colour wheel and see which colours are sitting next to one another. Those are the ones that you will want to use together to create this luminous effect, as well as keeping lots of your light tones visible. On the bird shown here, I have three main colours to create: blue, green and purple. For the blue feathers, I used a mixture of blue, turquoise and greens and blended them thoroughly into one another. As I mentioned, this is creating the base. You want to blend your colours thoroughly and seamlessly. The addition of the harmonious green and turquoise into these blue parts is what helps to create that luminous effect. Using straight blue tones like phthalo blue or ultramarine would make the feathers look flat, and using a white to add the luminous parts and highlights would just end up looking like highlights and not necessarily give the feathers that glow that you often see in this type of bird. The purple feathers are created using purple tones, of course, but it also built in pink and blue shades, as both these colours are either side of purple on a colour wheel. The pink here acts as the high shine and it is the highlight colour, and it adds that luminous glow and starts the colour shift towards that dark bluey purple, which is where you start to add the purple and blue tones. The green feathers were made using a mixture of green and turquoise. Now, I didn't add any straight yellow as a harmonious colour here, but opted for a sort of green yellow instead, like May green or earth green yellow from the Polychromos. It's still keeping that harmonious touch of yellow, but sort of embedded into the green tones. Adding a little bit of darker green for this particular iridescent colour is all that was really needed, and sometimes shifting into a sort of dark blue for shadows is all you kind of need for a luminous green effect. When you're choosing your tones for these particular feathers, you want to choose a range of different shades from each complementary colour, so don't just stick to mid-tone blues. You want to choose lighter and darker ones to add shadows and really enhance the look of the feathers. So for each individual colour, so for a blue feather, you'd pick a range of blues, a range of greens and a range of purples to create a really luminous look. One thing that I have found, however, is to try and keep your colour palette leaning towards either cool or warm tones, and try not to pick too many of the opposite tones. My palette for this particular bird was primarily cool toned. Even the pinks I picked out had a cool tone to them, and this just helps really balance everything nicely. If you have equal amounts of warm and cool toned colours, your palette will compete too much with itself, and it takes some of that luminous effect away from the feathers, as the colours are just constantly battling each other and it can be really distracting for the eye. So try and keep your palette either cool or warm toned, and if you need to add either cool or warm colours to either palette, then just keep them to like one or two. It may be difficult to tell warm and cool colours just by looking at a single pencil, but if you have a pencil swatch of your supplies, it's really easy to tell as all of your colours are there next to each other and you can see the subtle differences in each shade a lot more clearly. It does require some practice to be able to identify different tones straight off the bat, so if you want to enhance and hone this skill, spend some time looking at different colours next to each other, look at objects around your house and really analyse what you're seeing, and that technique will really grow and it will soon become second nature. Now let's talk about another step involved in creating and defining these feathers, and that's adding shading and highlights. Now your highlights are going to be made up of the base colours you very first laid down. So as I explained in the beginning, adding down the lighter colours and blending them out seamlessly, that's going to be your highlights, and that's where you want to put your lightest tones down first. So that's really simple. And also when creating these feathers, I try and steer clear of using any white as the highlights and just allow the very lightest tones to be the highlights of the piece. So you want to try and steer clear of white if possible. The shadows are a little trickier. Usually when creating shadows you'd use a blend of greys, browns, possibly even blacks when colouring fur or other types of feathers. But for iridescent feathers I find the best technique is to lay down your darkest hues of the colour you're portraying. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that you shouldn't use greys and browns to deepen the shadows, but rather see how deep and how much contrast you can create by using the harmonious tones first. For greens, you can use a deep cobalt green and a dark indigo to get some super nice shadows, and you're still using that harmonious palette of green and blue and not introducing a brown which could muddy the colours. Iridescent feathers need to be clean and bright and not muddy in any way, otherwise you lose that brilliant luminous nature of them. When you're creating your shadows, they don't always need to be blended out either. They don't always need to be seamless when adding in your details. Having some crisp, clear-cut areas of light and dark within individual feathers can create a radiant, bright effect, especially when stopping short of the tip of a feather and leaving the very end extremely light, so leaving those base layers exposed. You'll also notice the iridescent nature become apparent when you start adding in your shadows using a similar tone to the lighter base layers and midtones. Everything really starts to sing and work well together when you start to add in those shadows, and everything just becomes as one. To build the midtones I just mentioned, all you're going to need to do is just blend and layer your colours until you have the desired saturation and tone of colour, much like you would for any other coloured pencil piece. Use the tones in between your lights and darks. So for blue feathers, a light cobalt turquoise would be your highlight, a dark indigo the shadow, and your midtones could be built up with cobalt green, helio turquoise, and a middle phthalo blue. Ideally, for each colour of feather, you want to set out what's your lightest and darkest colour, and then arrange harmonious colours in between. When it comes to placement of tones, generally the darker tones are at the base of the feather where it meets the body of the bird, and the lighter tones are towards the tip, but that's not always the case, as you can see in my example here. Hummingbirds like this are often harder as they have so many tiny feathers to replicate and they don't always follow the same shading patterns. Feathers like this also often have clusters of lighter and darker areas, like a nice shift from light to dark, and those areas are containing multiple feathers. So it's really important to look at the light direction, see what's happening with each feather in order to gain that luminous effect. So just analyze if there's any tonal shift over multiple feathers. It can be a real task and a not so labour of love, but it is absolutely worth persevering with. Iridescent feathers do require a lot of work and don't always come together until the very, very end, but as long as you follow the rules I've tried and tested above, you should be good to go. If you fancy learning in depth about my colour choices and the layering process involved with this particular hummingbird, as well as the technique for the small scallop type feathers, then it's available on both my website and on Patreon. This took a little over 5 hours in total, and the whole thing has real-time narration, making it super simple to follow, so as I'm drawing I'm telling you what I'm doing. Not only do I have this tutorial, but I also have over 75 others ranging from simple beginner techniques to full wildlife drawings, and I'll leave the links to both platforms in the description below if you want to check them out. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button, and if you're new here, why not subscribe as well? I post new videos every single Friday to help you with your coloured pencil journey. Keep those pencils sharpened, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!